I actually didn't start Prince of Persia where most people did. I didn't start with The Sands of Time, I started with the third game. Which, looking back at it now, is a very strange way to experience a trilogy. I went from the end of the story to the middle and only then to the beginning. And somehow, even in that completely wrong order, I still fell in love with the series. But when I finally got around to The Sands of Time, the first game of the trilogy, it immediately felt different. It was calmer, slower, and much more focused on movement and problem solving than on fighting enemies. Even now, years later, this is still the one that feels the most special to me. What makes this video a little funny is that I actually recorded most of it weeks ago. I finished the recording, didn't edit it, didn't upload it, and just kind of let it sit there. Then a couple days later, Ubisoft announced that the Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time remake was cancelled. So suddenly, this video went from being about a game that might be coming back to one that feels even more firmly locked in the past. And honestly, that feels very fitting for this series. So today, I want to go back to where it all really started and talk about a game that, in my opinion, didn't just age well, but still shows how powerful storytelling in games can be when it's built directly into gameplay. The Sands of Time released in 2003, and even back then it stood out from a lot of action games. Yes, it had combat, enemies, and bosses, but most of the time you weren't really fighting, you were moving. The game constantly asks you to run across walls, swing from poles, climb ledges, and jump across platforms that look like they're about to collapse at any moment. Every section feels like a small spatial puzzle where one mistake can send you all the way back down. What could have easily been frustrating is completely transformed by one mechanic: the ability to rewind time. This wasn't just a cutscene trick or a one time story moment, it was a button you could press whenever something went wrong. Miss a jump, rewind. Take too much damage, rewind. Run into a bad situation without thinking, rewind and try again. That simple mechanic completely changes how the game feels. It doesn't just make the game easier, it makes you more confident. You're willing to experiment, take risks, and learn the space because failure isn't punished, it's expected. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why this game still feels good to replay today. Moment to moment, The Sands of Time is all about flow. You enter a room, take a second look around, and your brain immediately switches into problem solving mode. You start asking yourself where you can run, where you can jump, which walls are safe, and where enemies might appear. When everything clicks, the game feels incredible. You move through spaces in one smooth sequence, chaining jumps, wall runs, swings, and landings together without stopping. It feels less like playing a traditional action game and more like solving a moving puzzle with your own momentum. When you do mess up, the rewind system doesn't just erase the mistake, it teaches you timing, patience, and awareness. Over time, you start making fewer errors, not because the game is forgiving, but because you understand it better. Compared to the second and third games, which focus much more on combat and darker tone, this entry is clearly more interested in traversal and atmosphere. The fighting is still stylish for its time, but it never feels like the main attraction. The real focus is getting through the space in a way that feels smooth and intentional. That's probably why I liked this one so much as a kid. I always enjoyed parkour and puzzles more than pure combat, and this game leans heavily into that strength. Quick spoiler warning here because I'm going to talk about the full story. I'll leave a timestamp in the description if you want to skip ahead. The story begins with the prince joining his father's army in an attack on a city. During the invasion, he discovers a strange artifact, the Dagger of Time. Along with a magical hourglass, it's brought back to the palace, where the vizier convinces the prince to use the dagger and release the sands of time. This decision immediately turns into a disaster, Everyone in the palace is transformed into sand creatures, and the prince finds himself trapped inside the chaos he caused. What I really like about this story is that it isn't about saving the world from some distant evil, it's about fixing your own mistake. The prince isn't chosen, special, or destined for greatness, he's young, arrogant, and wrong. The entire story is framed as a retelling. The prince narrates events after they've already happened, which makes everything feel reflective, almost regretful. It's not just a sequence of levels, it's a memory being reconstructed. As he moves through the collapsing palace, he meets Farah, the princess of the city that was destroyed. She doesn't trust him, and for a good reason. Over time, though, they're forced to rely on each other. Their relationship grows naturally through shared danger, arguments, and small moments of trust. There is no dramatic romance, no over the top declarations. It feels like two people trying to survive something that never should have happened in the first place. By the end, the prince realizes that the only way to truly undo the damage is to go back to the very beginning and stop himself from releasing the sands at all. He does exactly that, and suddenly none of the events technically happened, but they still mattered because he remembers them. The prince is one of my favorite protagonists from that era. He starts off confident and somewhat arrogant, clearly trying to impress the person he's telling the story to. As the game progresses, his tone changes. He becomes quieter, more thoughtful, and more aware of his own failures. It's subtle, but it works extremely well. Farah is also surprisingly well written for a game from 2003. She isn't just there to be rescued. She fights, helps solve problems, and constantly challenges the prince's decisions. Most importantly, she doesn't immediately forgive him, which makes their dynamic feel grounded and believable. The vizier, meanwhile, represents pure ambition. He wants immortality and control, and he's willing to sacrifice everything for it. He isn't deeply complex, but he doesn't need to be. The real conflict of the story isn't the villain, it's the prince dealing with the consequences of his actions. One detail I've always liked and still find kind of amusing is how the prince slowly loses parts of his outfit as the game goes on. By the end, he's essentially running around shirtless, covered in sand and dust. On the surface, it's a cool visual choice, but it also works as quiet storytelling. You begin the game as a clean, confident royal, and you end it looking like someone who's been fighting through a collapsing palace for hours. The environments reinforce the idea. The palace doesn't feel like a collection of levels, it feels like a real place that's actively falling apart. Bridges collapse, towers crumble, and entire rooms are swallowed by sand. Even with dated graphics, the art direction still carries the atmosphere. That's why the cancelled remake still stings a bit, not because the original is unplayable, but because this world feels like it deserved another chance to be seen. So, did the Sands of Time age well? I think it did. The textures are low resolution and the character models are clearly from another era, but the animation, movement, and overall design still holds up remarkably well. The platforming is still satisfying, the time rewind mechanic is still brilliant, and the pacing feels better than in many modern games. It doesn't drag, it doesn't overstay its welcome, and it doesn't feel bloated. Compared to its sequels, which leaned much harder into combat and darker themes, this game feels more balanced and more adventurous. That balance is exactly why it's the entry I always come back to. Looking back, Prince of Persia was probably one of my favorite trilogies growing up. Not just because it looked cool, but because it made movement itself exciting. It taught you to think about space, timing, and momentum in a way few games did at the time. The Sands of Time was where all of that started. Even though I played it last, it ended up feeling like the heart of the trilogy. It's calm, it's powerful, simple but emotional, and far more focused on experience than spectacle. That's probably why I still think about it. It wasn't just a game about defeating enemies, it was a game about making mistakes and learning how to fix them. So yes, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time is still a special game for me. Not just because of nostalgia, but because the ideas behind it still feel smart today. Storytelling through mechanics, failure treated as learning, and movement treated as something expressive rather than functional. If you've never played it, I genuinely think it's still worth your time. And if you have, you probably understand why people are still disappointed about that remake. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like me to revisit more old games, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and let me know which games from your childhood you'd like to see next. I've got a long list, and this is only the beginning. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.